All right, so I wanted to go ahead and finish up the lecture on Calvinism and the Catholic Reformation, and then we're going to finish by talking about the religious wars that happened. So I want to take time out of class to kind of get through here. So we'll kind of talk about this, and we'll kind of briefly kind of go over some of these things and read some primary documents in class. So to begin with John Calvin here. So John Calvin, so he pretty much is going to rise to prominence as a reformer at the kind of towards the end of Martin Luther's career. And so he follows Calvin and also Ulrich Zwingli, as we had talked about in class. And so John Calvin, as a young man, is going to study law. But in 1533, he's going to end up experiencing a religious crisis and converting to Protestantism as a result of that. And through his experience, he comes to believe that God specifically selected him to reform the church. And so we see a lot of what he's going to do is going to be in Switzerland, which is where he lived. He was actually a French-born priest, but lived in Switzerland. And so ultimately, he's going to, you can see here, he wanted a society where church and state acted together. He thought basically a theocracy, right? Essentially where the government is run by the church. He thought that was the best form of government. And so that's one of the things that he's going to write about in his book, The Institutes of Christian Religion, in addition just to talking about the different doctrines that he believed. So a couple kind of important differences between Luther and Calvin. Calvin believes in the absolute sovereignty and omnipotence of God. I think Luther also would have believed in that as well. But the big differentiator here is that Calvin believed in the total weakness of humanity. It's kind of interesting because ultimately Calvin did not believe that as humans we have any free will at all. And so he ends up coming up with this idea. I mean, there is a scriptural basis for it, but ultimately the big differentiator between Calvin and Luther is that Calvin believes that we are saved through God's predestination. In other words, this is the idea that essentially at the beginning of time when God created the world, he chose beforehand who would be saved and who would not be saved, so who would end up going to hell. And so again, this is part of that, right? So if you're predestined, then ultimately there's nothing that you can do to change that fate. So if God decided you to be saved, then you're going to go to heaven, and there's nothing you can change that. If you're going to be eternally damned, there's nothing you can do to change that either. In class, we'll read an excerpt from Calvin and kind of talk a little bit more about predestination. But again, this is still a widely debated topic today, even within theological circles and stuff like that. So there's certainly no consensus on this. But again, that's the big thing that differentiates Calvin from Martin Luther. And so Calvin is going to help set up a theocracy essentially in Geneva. Essentially, one of the most important parts of that theocracy that he sets up is called the consistory. And essentially this was a body of laymen, so basically just regular people in the church, and pastors charged with investigating and disciplining deviations from proper doctrine and conduct. So remember kind of the thing that I had kind of mentioned, even though we see, again, cities changing over to Protestantism, again, this does not mean that there is any religious freedom. You can see here that just between the years of 1542 to 1546, you have 76 people that are banished from Geneva, and 58 are going to end up getting executed, whether it be for heresy, adultery, blasphemy, and even witchcraft, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. And so Geneva ultimately ends up becoming this model Christian community that's actually going to attract religious refugees from all over Europe, from France and England, Spain, even Scotland and Italy. And so, and it ultimately is also going to serve as the model for different churches in Scotland, specifically the Presbyterian Church in Scotland, the Huguenot Church in France, And also the Puritan churches, they're going to leave England and come over to the English colonies and establish New England. And so we're going to see Calvinism spread throughout Europe, again, especially to Scotland, which is going to be strictly Calvinist. Okay, so moving on to the Catholic Reformation. The Catholic Reformation is going to be the church's response to the Protestant Reformation. As we talked about, obviously, they are not happy about Luther's ideas. They're not going to be happy about the spread of Calvin's ideas. And they're going to want to try to do whatever they can to stop that. And so ultimately, they're going to have a Reformation of their own, again, to try to counter what the Protestant Reformation is doing. And so the Catholic Reformation is actually also referred to as the Counter Reformation because of that. And it all begins when Pope Paul III gets appointed Pope. One of the big differences about Paul III as opposed to the popes before is that he actually was focused on piety rather than power and wealth. And so, in other words, he actually was focused on doing what the church should be doing in terms of its religious mission, as opposed to just kind of building up power and wealth for himself. And so there are actually going to be a lot of improvements that he's going to support, including education for the clergy, because remember we talked about oftentimes some of the lower members of the clergy were very poorly educated. He is also going to fight for the end of simony, which is the practice of purchasing church offices, which again was a way that popes before had used to be able to get more money. He's also going to introduce, or at least supported improvements for stricter control over clerical life, and so meaning for the practices of the clergy. And so one of the things that we see Paul III do is establish the Holy Office in 1542. Now the Holy Office is going to have jurisdiction over the Roman Inquisition. The Roman Inquisition was a religious court that had been established for the purpose of basically trying heretics for the most part. I mean, they had the power to arrest, imprison, and execute suspected heretics. And it was a committee made up of 6 cardinals. And so the Holy Office is going to have jurisdiction or control over the Roman Inquisition. And one of the things that we see the Holy Office do is they publish the Index of Prohibited Books, which ultimately was a catalog of books that they forbid people to read. And of course, you know, as you can imagine, it's going to forbid the works of a lot of the Christian humanists, as well as by Protestants, so like Luther, Calvin, a lot of people that wrote similar ideas and stuff like that. Those books are all going to be banned and well, supposedly banned. Of course, some of those books are still going to be read throughout Europe, but as much as they can, they're going to try to prohibit those books from being read. All right, so one of the big things that Paul III does is he's going to end up calling a general council that's going to meet intermittently from 1545 to 1563 in Trent, Belgium. Now, he's not going to oversee the end of this because he actually is only going to serve as Pope until 1549. So it begins under Paul III, and then it will also continue under the following Pope, which is Paul IV. And so at this General Council, you know, the main goal, of course, is going to be to reform the Catholic Church. Now, the other goal is going to be to try to reconcile with the Protestants. And so they are going to invite a lot of prominent Lutherans and Protestants to try to gain some sort of reconciliation. But ultimately, throughout the entire ordeal, this is ultimately going to become impossible, mainly due to the belief, again, that we talked about with regard to Protestants, that they wanted the Scriptures to be the sole basis for the discussion. So again, going all the way back to Luther, that was one of his main ideas, right? The Scriptures alone are more important than any papal edicts or any decisions of any previous councils or anything like that, which of course the Catholic Church is not going to be willing to budge on. So ultimately we're going to find that reconciliation is going to prove impossible. And so, although they don't really do much in terms of reconciliation, they are going to make some other, I guess, modifications to Catholic beliefs. Some of them are going to represent a departure from what the church had previously taught, but as you'll see, a lot of these are not going to be different. A lot of them are going to be the same. They continue to give equal validity to scriptures and tradition. They're going to reaffirm the seven sacraments, right? 5 of which Luther had said there was no biblical basis for at all, but they reaffirm them anyway. They continued their teachings on transubstantiation, which we had talked about in class, which again was the idea that when they take communion, that the bread and the wine actually become the body and the blood of Christ. Of course, they don't, again, change physical form, but they do change that substance. So again, those first couple things, not really a change there. We do see a change here in the fact that they are going to require bishops to actually reside in their diocese. Remember that we talked about the fact that a lot of people were unhappy because bishops could actually hold multiple offices, and there was a lot of absenteeism because of that. He's also going to suppress simony, again, the practice of purchasing church offices. And then this next one is interesting. They're going to forbid the sale of indulgences. Now, although they end up forbidding the sale of indulgences, the really interesting thing is they still are going to say that indulgences were a valid expression of faith. Now, you've got to ask yourself the question, well, why would they say that indulgences are valid expressions of faith and yet ban the sale of them? That doesn't seem to make sense. But again, going back to what Pope Gregory VII had originally established in regard to the church, this was back in the 11th century. Remember, one of the things that he said is that the Roman or the Catholic Church will never be wrong, or never is wrong, and never will be to the end of time. And so understand, if they had essentially, they would have to come out and admit that they were wrong, which of course they didn't want to do, because then the follow-up question will be, well, what else are you wrong about? And so this is why they forbid the sale of indulgences while still saying that they were actually legitimate expressions of faith. And then they also are going to require every diocese to establish a seminary to educate and train the clergy. So again, they're trying to improve that education to make sure that the priests were actually educated, could actually read Latin and all those other things that they actually were required to do to be able to fulfill their job. Okay, so as we look at this map here, just wanted to throw this in here to show you kind of the spread of some of the different beliefs in terms of where they were located, which, by the way, just to kind of clarify, the Council of Trent and the Catholic Reformation, it actually will serve to help unify the church. And so you can see here, looking at this map, that the vast majority of Europe is going to remain Roman Catholic. Okay, you can see, all the yellow here is going to be primarily Lutheran. So that's again kind of northern Germany, where Luther is going to have his main impact. You can see the blue is Calvinism here in Switzerland, where Calvin lived in Geneva, and then it's going to spread north to the Netherlands and then eventually Scotland. Notice England is on its own with the Church of England, as we had talked about in class. So again, all of these ideas are going to spread. Europe is just going to become more religiously diverse as a result of the Protestant Reformation. That's one of the big effects of the Reformation itself. All right, now getting into the Jesuits. The Jesuits actually are going to be one of the reasons why the Catholic Reformation is going to be so successful. So the Jesuits actually had been around even prior to the Reformation, kind of going back to the 1520s. They were followers of a guy named Ignatius Loyola. And without getting much into what his specific beliefs were, I'll just suffice it to say that he believed in the Reformation of the Church. In making some changes, he recognized the validity of Luther's arguments against various aspects of the church, but at the same time didn't want to leave the church, was not willing to do any of that. Okay, and so the Jesuits are largely followers of Ignatius. They're going to be commissioned by Paul III after he becomes Pope. The main mission of them, and you can see their official name was the Society of Jesus. Their main mission was to improve people's spiritual condition. They didn't want to alter doctrine. They didn't want to reform the church. They just wanted to, quote unquote, help souls. And over time, they actually become a very highly centralized organization, very tightly knit. Again, they did not want to break away from the church. They're going to vow special obedience to the Pope, and they are going to end up actually traveling all over Europe. They're going to recruit clergy and actually end up converting a lot of people that had changed over to Protestantism. They're actually going to end up converting a lot of them back to Catholicism. And the Jesuits actually, not only are they going to kind of serve as missionaries in that regard around Europe, but they're also largely going to serve as missionaries to a lot of other parts of the world where we see European expansion. So when we look at like the New World, places like India and China and stuff like that. All right, so getting into some religious violence here. One of the biggest places we're going to see religious violence, of course, we saw it with the German Peasants' War, but we are also going to see it in France as well. And so ultimately, in France, I already mentioned that was one place that Calvinism is going to spread to. King Francis I, while he was king, he ends up, we see the kind of end of a series of wars under his reign that France had been involved in for quite a while. He's also going to be the one responsible for making the treaty with the Pope that we had talked about in Unit 1, the Concordat of Bologna, which is going to give the French king the right to appoint French bishops and abbots. All of this is going to help bring more money for King Francis. He's also, again, going to sell public offices as a way of making money as well. And ultimately, as we kind of get into the religious violence aspect, Calvinism becomes quite popular. Again, Calvin originally was a French priest, and so by the time that Henry II dies, we see about 1/10 of the population in France that are going to be made up of Huguenots. So again, Catholicism was still the dominant religion in France, but we see a decent percentage of the population that are going to convert over to Protestantism. And as you can see here, right, a lot of the French nobles are going to adopt Protestantism for economic gain. The ability to confiscate church property within their districts and to be able to sell it to private individuals. And so ultimately, this is going to lead to a number of clashes between Catholic lords and Calvinist lords as well. And actually, the interesting thing is a lot of this stuff is going to be incited by preachers. They're going to be, again, kind of talking against the other religion, often also is triggered by religious ceremonies. The worst example of this that we're going to see is the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572. And this was actually supposed to be a wedding feast. Now, St. Bartholomew's Day was also kind of like a Catholic holiday. I guess you could say they regularly had feasts and stuff like that to celebrate St. Bartholomew's life. And on this particular day, there was a marriage ceremony. It was between the king's sister, the king of France, his sister, Margaret of Valois, and the Protestant Henry of Navarre, which was a nearby region. Okay, and so he was actually, again, Protestant, and so the whole purpose of this marriage was to try to help reconcile Catholics and Huguenots, but ultimately it's going to end up sparking a massacre. And a lot of historians contribute this to the planning of the king's Catholic mother, Catherine de' Medici, who's going to ultimately kind of plan out this massacre. And so on this day, so August 24th, 1572, this is after the wedding, you have the wedding feast, and you have Catholics that are going to end up just massacring the Huguenot wedding guests. This violence is going to, of course, spread over into the rest of the city and into the provinces. And in just that one day alone, you've got 12,000 people that are going to end up being killed. And so this is going to ignite this civil war that ultimately is going to last for 15 years. And you see, of course, a lot of the normal destruction that comes along with war. You've got agriculture in many areas that's just going to be totally destroyed. Commercial life is going to decline. You've got starvation and death as a result. And so this is going to go on for 15 years. And so during that period of civil war, there's going to be this group of moderates from both faiths. They were called politiques, that believe that the only way that they could essentially reverse this collapse was through the restoration of a strong monarchy. And so anyway, through a series of events, we're going to see one of those politiques, Henry of Navarre, that is ultimately going to become king. Okay, so remember, that's the same guy that we were talking about, like this St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. It happens at this guy's wedding. Now, he actually, in that 15-year period, actually ended up getting, because he was Protestant, he got excommunicated by the Pope. He actually had his succession rights to the throne that are going to be removed. But through the death of Henry II and then Henry III as well, ultimately Henry is going to end up ascending to the throne after he converts to Catholicism. And so he ends up, again, promising to convert to Catholicism. He actually ends up getting restored to the church, if you will, so he had his excommunication reversed by the Pope. And ultimately, he does this to try to bring peace to France, right? He doesn't do this because necessarily he bought into Catholicism. His beliefs didn't change, but he did it to bring peace. You can see he's willing to sacrifice his religious principles for that political necessity. So he's actually going to become king in 1589, but he's actually going to have quite a difficulty actually taking his position on the throne because there were still a lot of Catholics that wanted to prevent him from becoming king, particularly Spain. Again, Philip II in Spain, the same guy that had attacked England, trying to overthrow Elizabeth, he did not want Henry to become king. And so he ends up supporting the Catholics that are fighting against Henry this entire time. And so even though he gets, again, crowned in 1589, it's going to be a number of years before he actually is going to ascend to the throne. I think it's going to be about 8 or 9 years before he actually solidifies his role as a king. And so this is why it's in 1598 here that we actually see the king is going to end up issuing the Edict of Nantes. And so the Edict of Nantes, even though it's going to reaffirm Catholicism as the official religion of France, it is also going to grant the freedom of worship to the Huguenots in France. So specifically in 150 towns that were specified Huguenot towns. And so the other effect of this ultimately is going to end up paving the way for absolutism in France, which we'll end up talking about later down the road. So this is just one of the major examples of religious violence that's going to happen as a result of the Reformation. Now, we'll kind of finish up with talking about witch hunts here. This is the last big example of religious violence that's going to take place. And so witchcraft was something that was not necessarily new in Europe at the time. It actually been around even before the Reformations, going back all the way to the 1480s. But we really see the height of this, what we call witchcraft mania, between 1560 and 1600. Now, also during this time, again, bear in mind that there's also kind of this heightened religious sense all across Europe, all this religious violence that's taking place. And so witchcraft is going to be just one of the things that kind of develops even more during this time period. Now, if we go back to the Middle Ages, people, they understood witches as people that used magical power to get what they wanted. But that definition really changes here during the Reformation, to where they literally believe that people were being used by the devil to do what he wanted. And so they thought witches did all sorts of things, including engaging in sexual orgies with the devil. They thought that they, flew through the night to other meetings with witches, which kind of witch Sabbaths, if you will. They thought that they stole communion wafers and unbaptized babies for their use in their rituals. And some are even going to claim that witches are organized into some sort of international conspiracy to try to overthrow Christianity. A lot of this obviously probably wasn't true, but at the same time, it was something that was that people believed at the time. So, as much as we can tell, of course, we don't know the exact number of people that are tried. There aren't great records of this, but scholars kind of estimate that between 100,000 to 200,000 people are officially going to be tried, and anywhere from 40 to 60,000 are going to be executed. Okay, so depending on the number, you're looking at probably 25 to 50% of the people that are tried of witchcraft actually get executed. Of those who were executed, you notice that the great majority of them were women, and a lot of this was influenced because of misogynistic beliefs. Again, the belief that women were weaker, and so they also believed that women were more susceptible to the devil as a result of that. I mean, if you think back to the Bible story about Adam and Eve, well, who was the first one to be tricked by the devil? Well, of course, it was Eve. And so, again, this kind of flows down into this belief that women were somehow morally and spiritually weaker than men. All right, and so if we look at kind of what allows the witch hunts to kind of take place, one of the big things is we have a change in legal procedure at the time. And so prior to this time, it was the type of legal procedure that was largely used was an accusatorial legal procedure, which is like what we have in the United States today. So in this type of legal procedure, you've got people that can accuse others of a crime, and the courts kind of act as this impartial party that essentially hears arguments from both sides and decide whether the defendant is guilty or not. Now, also, for them at that time, if somebody accused somebody else of a crime and that person was found innocent, then sometimes the plaintiff could actually be held liable for any false charges that they made. Well, the new type of legal procedure that they're going to use during this time was called inquisitorial legal procedure. And this essentially is when the charges are brought by the court itself. And so a person can accuse somebody of a crime, but the court is actually going to investigate it. So it's not up to the accuser to bring proof of the guilt of the defendant, but the court itself is going to end up investigating those charges. And so this is where we see a lot more intense questioning, even with torture, by the court. And so usually what happens is it begins with an accusation, let's see, once the charge was made, the suspect usually brought in for questioning, and a lot of times, surprisingly, confession was generally followed by execution. And a lot of people, again, are going to confess. Now, of course, you can beg the question, well, are they confessing because they just want the torture to stop, or are they confessing because they actually did the crime? And so this is why we really can't tell today whether whether they actually were practicing witchcraft or if they really believed that they were witches. And so, but what we do find is that women were much more prominent among the accusers and the witnesses as well. And this is largely because the actions that witches were accused of were generally part of a woman's sphere. So whether they applied to, well, I guess maybe it's easier to say this. So, if you've got a sick baby or something like that, well, people are going to assume that that's maybe because somebody has cursed my baby or cursed me or something like that. By the way, just on another side note, this is another thing that we see during this time, and again, this contributes to witchcraft, is because of the religious hysteria that was going around, is that people were saying that natural events, whether it be storms or something like that, sickness, that they were attributing those to supernatural causes. Again, thinking that, okay, well, the devil must somehow be responsible for this. And so as we look at these witch hunts or witch panics that are going to end up taking place, a lot of the larger witch hunts often are going to occur after some sort of climatic disaster. We also see these in areas that had a lot more religious conflict. So like throughout the Holy Roman Empire, Switzerland, parts of France. And so again, when we look at the fact that, okay, well, most of the witch hunts are taking place where there's a lot more religious violence, you kind of see the witch hunts, the witch panics as a result of that religious violence, and kind of a product of that. And so ultimately, I think it's probably safe to conclude that a lot of people that, were accused of witchcraft were actually not guilty, but that there were other causes, whether they be socioeconomic issues, religious tensions that are going to end up contributing to the spread of these witch panics. So ultimately, the witch panics are going to begin to decline after 1600. A lot of it is going to have to do with new ideas about science and reason in the 17th century that are ultimately going to bring doubts on whether witches could actually make pacts with the devil. And so in some sense, because of the scientific revolution, leads to the decline of these ideas. So, all right, that brings us to the end of the notes here. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about some of these ideas in class. And so I will see you guys then.